History often sees symbols as mere decoration and architecture as a simple background, but power has always known better. It understands that a physical space communicates authority long before any laws are written or policies are announced. It begs the question, what if the most important messages in American financial history weren't delivered through speeches or statutes? What if they were quietly embedded in the buildings, the institutions, and the social rituals that determined who was trusted to make decisions for everyone else? We often get caught up in debates about secret symbols and hidden societies, but what if that distracts us from a much deeper truth? What if real influence doesn't need secrecy at all? What if it thrives on a shared language, shared values, and, most importantly, shared access? And here's the critical link to today. What if the inflation, the debt pressure, and the economic insecurity so many of us feel can be traced back to a specific moment? A moment in 1917 when trusted, private networks quietly replaced open, public debate, all in the name of efficiency and national survival. Before we dive deep into this story, I want to anchor it in the present. Take a second and think about this simple question. Where are you watching this from? Your answer connects this history directly to your life, right now. And if you're someone who wants the unfiltered truth about how symbols, architecture, and finance came together to shape the modern world, this is the moment to subscribe. Because this documentary is going to examine what official narratives almost always leave unexplored. At the very center of this story stands a figure we think we know, John D. Rockefeller. His legacy is often reduced to numbers on a balance sheet, staggering wealth and large-scale philanthropy. But this view overlooks how meticulously he cultivated legitimacy, continuity, and influence through institutions designed to outlive his direct control. By the early 20th century, Rockefeller's fortune had already reshaped American industry, yet his strategy had shifted. It was no longer just about accumulating wealth. It was about preserving it. He understood that wealth alone is vulnerable unless it is embedded within a framework of social trust and institutional respectability. Think about the houses, the offices, and the philanthropic buildings associated with the Rockefeller name. They were never just structures. They were designed to project specific qualities, order, stability, and a kind of moral seriousness. These were qualities that resonated powerfully with the cultural language of the elite networks of that era. They were visual statements of reliability and permanence. For decades, observers have pointed to the architectural motifs, the symbolic layouts, and the ceremonial spaces in these buildings. Many have interpreted them as evidence of secret affiliations, of hidden cabals pulling strings behind the scenes. But these interpretations, while tantalizing, often miss the more practical and arguably more powerful function of symbolism in elite life. Symbols don't need to hide messages to be effective. Their real power lies in their ability to signal belonging. They reinforce a shared identity. They quietly but firmly establish the boundaries between insiders and outsiders. They create a common ground where trust is assumed, not earned. To understand how this worked, we need to look at the years leading up to America's entry into World War I. The nation was a pressure cooker of tension. Rapid industrial growth was clashing with widespread social unrest. Labor movements were gaining strength, antitrust campaigns were challenging monopolies, and reform politics were questioning the very nature of concentrated wealth. The conventional narrative frames this period as a straightforward struggle between monopolies and democracy. But that overlooks a far more subtle and sophisticated strategy. Instead of resisting reform outright, elite institutions adapted by embedding themselves within the reform movement itself. How did they do it? Philanthropic foundations funded by the very titans of industry being challenged began to pour money into universities, research institutes, and policy studies. These institutions then shaped the very language of progress, efficiency, and expertise. They defined the problems and, conveniently, proposed solutions that quietly preserved the influence of those who financed them. It was a masterclass in shaping the conversation from the inside. Then, in 1917, war arrived. The United States government suddenly faced an unprecedented logistical and financial challenge. Modern warfare required a level of coordination that open markets alone simply could not deliver quickly enough. So, where did the state turn for help? It turned to those trusted networks. Bankers were called upon to organize massive bond drives to fund the war effort. Industrial leaders were brought in to advise on production priorities, retooling factories for military needs, and philanthropic figures who had spent years promoting their expertise in efficiency and administration were now offering that same expertise to the government. In this moment of national crisis, the boundary between public service and private interest became incredibly blurred. This didn't happen through some grand conspiracy or secret plot. It happened through respectability. The same people who had built and shaped private industry were now shaping public policy, all under the honorable banner of national necessity. They were seen as the experts, the ones who could get things done. This is where the idea of a Masonic house becomes so significant, not as literal proof of hidden plots, but as a powerful metaphor for how power operates. Power prefers environments where decisions feel consensual, orderly, and inevitable, rather than messy and contested. These private spaces, these clubs, boardrooms, and foundations didn't replace democratic institutions like Congress. They complemented them. They provided a venue where the important decisions could be hashed out among trusted peers before they ever reached the public stage for a vote. And in doing so, they shaped outcomes profoundly, without ever appearing to govern. As this wartime administration expanded, a subtle but fundamental transformation occurred, one that few people recognized in real time. Coordination began to replace competition as the default assumption in the economy. Expertise began to replace public accountability as the guiding principle of governance. And networks, these closed circles of trust, began to replace open markets as the primary mechanism for deciding who gets what. The symbols mattered, not because they encoded secrets, but because they reinforced this sense of belonging, this shared identity among the decision makers. They were a constant, visual reminder of who was in the room and who wasn't. And amidst all this, one specific institutional framework was quietly being put into place. A framework that would ensure this new style of coordination, born of wartime necessity, would survive long after the war ended. It was the mechanism that would transform a temporary emergency measure into a permanent feature of our economic and political structure, the echoes of which we are still living with today. You think you know how power works. You see presidents, generals, and CEOs making decisions in the public eye. But what if I told you the real story, the one that truly shapes our world, isn't happening on C-SPAN or in press conferences? It's happening in the quiet, coordinated spaces between public institutions and private networks. Let's go back to 1917. America is mobilizing for World War I. The biggest change wasn't on the battlefield or in the factories. It was in how power itself was exercised. A new system was born, one that favored speed and expertise over public debate. This was a shift from visible government to coordinated administration, where who you knew and what you knew mattered more than your official title. At the heart of this story is a symbol, like Rockefeller's house. But these symbols weren't secret codes, they were gateways. They signaled that you were part of an elite circle, that you shared the same ideas about order, efficiency, and leadership. You didn't need a secret handshake to get in. You needed recognition, a solid reputation, and access. Think about it. When the government needed to figure out war financing, logistics, and industrial coordination, who did they call? They didn't hold a town hall. They turned to the titans of banking, industry, and philanthropy. These were people who had already been working together for years on private boards and advisory committees. Their recommendations weren't just suggestions, they carried immense authority. Why? Because of their track records and the mutual trust they'd built over decades. This private-public partnership made decision-making incredibly fast during a crisis. But it also had a major downside. It narrowed the field of what was considered a good idea. Any solution that challenged the established order was quickly dismissed as impractical or even dangerous. Coordination became the ultimate goal. And the people already in the best position to coordinate were the ones who benefited the most. The institution that cemented this new way of operating didn't market itself as a shadowy cabal. It presented itself as a modern, efficient solution to complex problems. It was about replacing messy public arguments with clean expert consensus. The name of the group that bridged this gap between private networks and public power is rarely mentioned in history books, yet its influence on money, credit, and power outlived the war by a century. To understand how symbolic affiliation became real, durable financial influence, we have to look at the mechanics, how elite coordination became official government policy. This is where a temporary wartime necessity started to harden into a permanent structure. The first mechanism was what we can call advisory governance. Wartime boards and committees were stacked with leaders from banking and industry. This meant the people with the practical knowledge were also the ones setting the agenda. It was efficient, yes, but it also baked private sector assumptions directly into public policy. For example, between 1917 and 1919, the US government issued a staggering $21 billion in Liberty and Victory bonds. This was an unprecedented level of national debt. And who managed it? Private banks. They organized the bond sales, managed the liquidity, and advised on the terms, all while collecting fees and interest that minimized their own risk. The second mechanism was reputational leverage. Figures from respected institutions, like universities and philanthropic foundations, were brought in. They were seen as neutral experts, not as people with a stake in the outcome. Their recommendations carried enormous weight, not because of any legal power, but because disagreeing with them during a national emergency would look irresponsible. This created a subtle but profound shift in accountability. Decisions started coming out of committees, not from elected officials. They were based on procedure and expertise, not on votes or public mandates. Responsibility became so diffused across different institutions that it was almost impossible to challenge the outcomes after the fact. The third mechanism was credit insulation. The government needed certain industries and banks to be stable for the war effort. So, the central banking system made sure these essential institutions had easy access to financing. They were insulated from risk. Meanwhile, smaller firms that weren't deemed essential faced much tighter credit. They couldn't compete. This accelerated the consolidation of power in key sectors of the economy. We can see the effects in the data. Between 1917 and 1920, consumer prices shot up by over 30%, but wages didn't keep up. The costs of the war were effectively transferred to regular households through inflation, while those who owned assets saw their wealth preserved or even grow. The fourth mechanism was institutional migration. After the war, when all these temporary emergency agencies were dissolved, what happened to the people who ran them? They didn't just go home. They, along with their practices and their core assumptions, migrated into permanent government bodies. They moved into regulatory offices, financial committees, and even university programs. This ensured that the new, coordinated way of doing things continued long after the crisis that created it had passed. The temporary fix became a permanent feature of the system. And finally, the fifth mechanism was cultural reinforcement. This is where the symbols, the architecture, and the rituals come back in. These things didn't write the laws, but they played a crucial supporting role. They reinforced a shared identity within these elite networks. They built cohesion, trust, and mutual recognition. This is what made their coordination so reliable over the long term. Symbols didn't replace laws, they stabilized the relationships between the people who made the laws. They signaled alignment and reduced the friction among the decision makers. The numbers tell the story of what happened next. By 1920, public debt was over $25 billion, locking future government budgets into long-term obligations. Industrial concentration grew across energy, transportation, and manufacturing, even while politicians were still talking about breaking up monopolies. And financial institutions became even more powerful intermediaries between the state and the economy. This wasn't the result of some secret plot hatched in a dark room. It was the natural outcome of a system that rewarded coordination, protected the powerful, and prized stability above all else. The dramatic language we often use talk of conspiracies and secret societies actually hides a more disturbing reality. What happened was a reframing of concepts. Greed was rebranded as stewardship. Transparency was replaced with illusion. Taking huge risks with other people's money became official policy, a moral hazard, and a financial system that extracts wealth started to present itself as a protector of the economy. When the First World War ended, many Americans expected life to go back to normal. They thought the special partnership between private networks and the government would just fade away along with the emergency powers. They imagined a return to open markets, clear government actions, and fair competition. But they were wrong. They underestimated how much those wartime habits of coordination, relying on experts, and trusting institutions had changed the way decisions were made. It turns out, systems built for a crisis often stick around, especially when they work well. The most lasting legacy of places like the Rockefeller House isn't some hint of secret rituals, but something far more powerful, the normalization of influence that happens behind the scenes. Once these elite networks proved they could stabilize markets, gather resources, and handle complex problems faster than democratic governments, their role stopped being a special exception and became business as usual. This wasn't a one-time thing. The same pattern showed up again and again throughout the 20th century. During the Great Depression, for example, coordination between financial and industrial giants once more took the place of competition. The justification to prevent a total economic collapse. This reinforced the idea that it was better to have a small group of experts in charge than to have accountability spread out among the many. Then came the Second World War, which took centralized planning and financial management to a whole new level. Private money became deeply embedded within the very structure of state power, on a scale unseen before. Does any of this sound familiar? As the decades rolled on, the actual physical places where elites met became less important. What mattered were the new norms they had established. Policy discussions moved from private homes to corporate boardrooms, exclusive conferences, and international forums, but the underlying logic stayed the same. Decisions were still being shaped by the people with access to capital, the right credentials, and institutional credibility. In our modern era, these dynamics are now global, and they operate at lightning speed. Think about it. Central banks manage interest rates and control the flow of money, which has a huge impact on jobs, the value of our homes, and our financial stability. International financial institutions, like the IMF or the World Bank, influence national policies through the conditions they attach to their loans and their responses to crises. And financial markets, they react instantly to signals sent out by a very small number of trusted authorities. The real danger of this system isn't its secrecy, but its familiarity. It's the fact that we've gotten so used to it. When this kind of coordination becomes routine, any alternative way of doing things starts to seem unrealistic or even impossible. When expertise becomes the ultimate authority, accountability starts to weaken. And when stability becomes the number one goal, problems like inequality and exclusion are often treated as acceptable side effects, just the cost of doing business. The symbols that once decorated the homes of the elite now serve as metaphors for a deeper truth about how power works. Power prefers environments where decisions feel inevitable, not debated. Influence thrives in places where trust replaces scrutiny. And control is most effective when it doesn't even feel like control anymore. This is the philosophical cost of the system that grew out of the crises of the early 20th century, a society that relies on expert coordination without clear, transparent limits risks forgetting how to ask the most important questions: who really benefits from these decisions, and who is paying the price? A financial system built to manage emergencies gradually starts to need emergencies just to justify its own existence and scope, and a public that gets used to stability being delivered from on high that lose the skills and the will to demand accountability from below. Understanding this history doesn't mean I have to believe in secret societies or hidden oaths. It just requires recognizing how symbols, institutions, and financial mechanisms all work together, reinforcing one another to shape outcomes that are far beyond the reach of ordinary democratic participation. If this has challenged how you think about power, influence, and legitimacy, consider sharing it with someone you know, especially someone who believes that authority only works through visible laws and public elections. Subscribe if you want to see more investigations into how the structures of the past are quietly shaping our modern economic lives. And as familiar solutions keep returning during new crises, always wrapped in the language of expertise and necessity, ask yourself one final question: are we any wiser now, or are we just walking the same old path, but this time in better suits? Thanks for watching.